And we have with us from Georgia, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Georgia in 2008, Eka Tkeshelashvili. She was running the Foreign Affairs Ministry exactly at the time of the Russian-Georgian war, which was lasting for 6 days. So, Eka, thanks a lot. You're here with us during this August day. As we know, there are today really a lot of similarities. If we compare, there are the Olympic Games running, the August, the politicians are on holidays, but we hear a lot of threats. And, there is a feeling of escalation. So, of course, it's understandable that, the Olympic, the August, it's probably some kind of symbolic things. But there are a lot of talks that the Kremlin had been playing with the politicians in Tbilisi back then, as probably is playing with the Ukrainian politicians, to provocate and to ask, would they answer? Because in the end, even in the foreign press, the situation in Georgia looked like, a lot of discussion that Saakashvili had started it. It was not the reasonable response. It could be smaller, so he kind of done that. What, after some years, I know the situation is different, but I know you're closely following the situation in Ukraine, in Crimea. What are the lessons learned? What can you tell?
Well, the first lesson, obviously, that one could draw as a parallel to what happens in Ukraine right now is how similar the pre-planning from the Russian side is happening right now. And then if one asks me who is the main sort of target for focus for the Russian Federation in terms of the nerves game, it's the international community. It's not the government in Ukraine. It has never been the government in Georgia as well. If Russia tests anybody, primarily it's the international community. To see what is the reaction from international community, primarily from the United States and from Europe, and then to see what are the red lines actually that they have to have in mind. And then as long as international community's reaction is weak, as long as it's just a request for both sides to de-escalate the situation, that's like a green light for Russia, basically. Then Russia sees that there's no real commitment to the situation, there's no real comprehension of the gravity of the situation, and then they can actually act, change the situation with the new fait accompli they can establish, and then negotiate from that point of view then.
Hromadske itself is calling the commentators, the diplomats, the politicians in Berlin, in other capitals, in order to hear this reaction. But we have really short commands about this de-escalation. We really understand it's August. You were in very similar position running the foreign ministry. It could be understandable. But still, how was it for you back then? And what would be also this sign that, the Kremlin hear the message that it's not too weak? What response would be, the relevant response to the situation?
Well, it's a very well calculated plan in terms of choosing the time, obviously. So August, Olympics, all of that is very pragmatic. It's not just symbolic, obviously. And one needs to add to that the pre-election season in the United States as well, when the United States is absorbed in its own political process rather than being capable to act outside in as much as it would have been in other situations. So this momentum is very well chosen, has been chosen like that, obviously, in the case of Georgia, and then it resembles in that way to what is happening right now in Ukraine as well. So this is the biggest test to international community, how vigilant it could be. And in terms of contacts, it has been immensely difficult to get in touch with colleagues at the time, even against the background of extremely escalated situation at the time in Georgia. I frequently think when people speak about war in Georgia, as if it just happened out of the blue. It was a spiral of escalation of the situation a month before the war situation itself, when Georgian side has been frantically trying to change the course of action so that we would change the negotiating formats, and then we would actually have the process which would de-escalate this situation and turn it into the diplomatic action. And the last hope at the time that I remember we've had with the so-called Steinmeier plan, it was actually a plan of the friends of the UN Secretary General, headed by Germany, and then has been called because of that like Steinmeier's plan. And then the last round of, or the first round of negotiations was planned for the 5th of August, and then Russians at that time basically declared that they have been planning to go to vacation and they could not have shown up to the negotiating table. This was the latest, the starkest sign that Russia was not planning to go into a negotiating format at all. And then the course of action when it comes to the war action has been already put in place. And there's something that resembles that. It's not analogous, but then resembling of that is when Putin now declared that he doesn't see any reason for him to participate in the Normandy format negotiations that have been planned at the heads of the states level, since he doesn't see any reason to negotiate at this point. And that's something that should be worrying very much for international community, obviously, at this moment.
And Eka, I probably should remind for the international audience that as somebody we were also reporting as the Ukrainian journalist that at that time there were a lot of information we were hearing about the thousands of people dead. Now we know we're speaking about hundreds. There are still the lives both in South Ossetia and in Georgia. But we hear still some criticism towards the Saakashvili government you've been representing at that time, that it was not legitimate response, that in the end you shouldn't be provoked. If we do not drive these parallels with Ukraine, but are talking precisely about that situation, what do you think, after thinking and about the Russian-Georgian war after the years, what could be done differently? Also with probably the thing that we are not left with the feeling, we still kind of a murky feeling who had started, who is guilty.
I mean, it's to me now, it's frankly a rhetorical question, especially after Crimea and especially the war in Ukraine, because at least now, for those who have been skeptical about what happened in Georgia at the time, it should have been an eye-opener how much it fits the scenario of revisionist Russia in that sense. And then in Georgia, we've had months of escalation, not to go into all of the details of the situation, violation of all the negotiating formats that we've had at the time, obligations from the Russian side. We've had independent attempts from Georgian side on a bilateral level to change the situation with Russians as well. When we've had at the time the new president in Russia, we've tried even with Russians to change something so that we would have had negotiating formats working rather than escalation on the ground from the military point of view. And it has been an immense work at the time that has been done in terms of giving the potential for talks rather than for the war at the time. Unfortunately, international community was not ready at the time to comprehend that Russia was ready to attack its neighboring country, and it was already pre-planned. So they thought that if they would just call both sides to refrain from any action that would have been military by nature, this would have de-escalated the situation. Nobody talked about sanctions at that time. Nobody talked about any reaction in a meaningful sense. The price that Russia would have paid if Russia would invade a neighboring country. And for Russia, it was a green light, and Russia acted upon that. And as I've said already, I mean, even for the 5th of August, when Russia said that it would not participate in the negotiating process, even that was not a wake-up call for our friends in the West at the time, for them to comprehend that the war was getting inevitable at the time. And the situation was really very grave at the time, with artillery shellings of our villages and non-stop military action by the Russian military combatants at the time. So it didn't happen out of the blue. There was no simple provocation of any kind. It was an incursion on the territory of Georgia, and Georgia had to defend itself at the time. And unfortunately, nobody was able to stop Russia at the time by not taking seriously the threat that Russia posed to Georgia at the time.
Eka, thanks a lot. That explains the situation a lot, and we also hope it clarifies the situation from the Russian-Georgian war in 2008. As though there are a lot of fog of the war, there are always still the figures and the facts, and we are able to find it, and we are here in order to do that.